Welcome everybody. My name is Peter Reiner. I'm a professor here at UBC at the National Core for Neuroethics and an associate at the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies, which has sponsored this event this evening entitled, Am I My Brain? And as many of you know, there's kind of a flood of magazine articles, books, movies, and more that extol the wonders of the brain. Day by day we see this, and the more that this occurs, the more that the public is confronted by the notion that the brain is central to all that we do. Indeed, it has been suggested, and I would endorse this view, that we are our brains. Now, it's not the case that we're not also our bodies, or our genes, or our social relations, or even our extended minds in the forms of computers and things like that. All that is true. Rather, it's that when we think of who we are as persons, when we think about the fundamental features of who we are, it's kind of difficult to ignore the suggestion that that we're thinking of is really our brain. Now, the notion that the brain is the center of our inner lives brings with it both some promise and some foreboding, glass half empty, half full. And what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is share with you some of the implications that this particular worldview, this brain-centric view, has for society at large. So before I became a neuroethicist, I was a hardcore neurobiologist, and to neurobiologists like me, this sign, which is on the side of a building at the corner of 57th and Broadway in Manhattan, it's been there for a couple of decades, is a message that's actually quite obvious, that depression, although we still don't know exactly what it is a change somehow in the underlying biology of the brain. It's not a flaw in character. And the idea, of course, is that taking this perspective changes how we view depression and how we view people with depression. And that this reductionist, brain-centered view, which some may find unappealing, moves in some way to reduce stigma towards the mentally ill. And in fact, over the last 20, 30 years, there has been some move in that direction. But it's not just mental illness that falls under this umbrella. Addiction as well. In a famous paper entitled Addiction is a Brain Disease, and It Matters, Alan Leshner, who was then director of the National Institutes of Drug Abuse in the United States, argued that viewing addiction through this same lens, the notion that there's a change in the chemistry of the brain, has a big impact on the sorts of policies that we might put forward when dealing with people with addictions. So these are kind of encouraging stories that we could reduce stigma by taking this brain-centered view. But there are some other implications of this that are sometimes disturbing, at least a little challenging, and it would not be right if I didn't share those with you as well. One of these is the issue of responsibility. And there's nowhere that this issue is more acute than in our treatment of criminals. For if all our actions and all our desires, all our decisions, everything that we do are based upon the mechanical working of our brains, then actions that we designate as good and bad are equally dependent upon that same underlying neurobiology. Now, some people have argued that this makes the notion of responsibility disappear to the vanishing point. And this is certainly a source of discomfort, I think, for us all. And I think that there's actually quite a healthy middle ground to be tilled, that society can and probably should still hold people responsible for their actions, because it represents an important way of enforcing social norms. At the same time, if we take this brain-centric view seriously and we think about it a bit, it leads us away from harsh retributivist notions of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and guides us towards a more compassionate reading of why people might do bad things. In many ways, and I think people find this surprising, this hard, neurocentric view provides a modern take on the wisdom teachings of many religious traditions, which is to have compassion for those who have committed misdeeds, rather than vengefully lashing out at them. Now, the conversation gets even more interesting when we turn our attention to love. As I mentioned at the beginning, we don't use our brains just for thinking, but the entire panoply of our inner lives are mediated by the brain. And one of the things that our brains do is love. The truth is that this is kind of a bothersome notion for many. And it was brought home to me, I think 3 or 4 years ago, when a student by the name of Sarah Park was a Fulbright scholar at the National Core for Neuroethics. And we have a weekly journal club, and she was presenting a paper that week where they were doing fMRI imaging, the kinds of images that we saw with the music, of young people deeply in love. So within a month of falling deeply in love. And it turned out that Sarah, in fact, had been involved in collecting some of these images. She had been an undergraduate at Stanford. She was working in the lab. And she described how challenging it was for her to sit there and code these images of many of these people were her friends. And think about that love happens in your brain. She put it very wonderfully in a blog post that she wrote on this. She said it was like finding out that Santa's really just your mom in a red bathrobe. So it turned out to be an incredibly interesting journal club discussion. And I explained to her that early in my career as a neurobiologist, I too had felt cognitive dissonance when I realized that love and really everything was instantiated in my brain. I wasn't immune to this same thing. But that over time, I was able to resolve these issues. And now I can hold two thoughts in my head at the same time. One is that love is the result of neural activity in my brain. At the same time, I can fully experience the unbridled joy that comes as the result of the love that I feel for my wife. For me, these two experiences are now one. But Sarah's description draws our attention to one of the risks that this brain-centric view of ourselves brings to modern living. To experience, in the words of Owen Flanagan, a kind of neuroexistential crisis. That reducing our experiences to the mechanics of the brain somehow cheapens them, robs them of their mystery. I would submit that the solution is not to shy away from the issue, but to face it head on, because actually we really have no choice. And what we're really facing is a deepening of our understanding of who we are as sentient beings. And these answers are being informed day by day and month by month by advances in the neurosciences, in philosophy, in sociology, in the arts, and more. And truly, sometimes it is and will be disquieting. But this is the modern predicament, and this is where we are. Challenge for us in the field of neuroethics, and I would submit for us all, is to work together to use these newfound insights about who we are, to become more understanding of the foibles that afflict us all, to become more compassionate, in short, to become more humane humans. Thank you.